Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, James Hollis, thank you very much for joining me today at Rewind Yourself and welcome.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you.
You said when we exchanged our emails that you're, say, mostly no to invitations right now. You said this one felt like it could be meaningful conversation. What exactly would make it one? I mean, is there a particular reason you've
Well, it
decided to
seems
say?
to me, based on what you said to me, that your focus really was trying to discern what's important in a person's life, issues of which one might be mindful in the conduct of daily life, and that you were particularly interested in the transmission of life and lived experiences. And so I'm 86 now, and certainly have a few war stories, so to speak, about life. And at the same time, consider myself still a beginner and learning what life is about and what I'm about and what relationships about. So these conversations are also of interest to me because I learn from them and I grow from them, and they force me to discern my own values in a way that might just be reflexively responded on other occasions. So I think your project is an eminently worthy project, Matt, and let's have at it as best you wish.
I truly appreciate it. It means the world to me, and thank you very much for making the time to have this conversation with me today. So, if we were to run your life not to the highlights reel, but to the moment that actually made you, where would we land?
I think so many different experiences, but I have to probably zero in on one of them. And that, ironically, was a depression at midlife. You remember the first sentence of Dante's Inferno, midway in life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood, having lost the way. And at age 35, I had everything I wanted: a happy family, a teaching profession, which I adored, a good life situation, and yet I was visited by a depression. And it sent me to my first hour of therapy. And it's the first time I ever truly began to deal with the idea that there was an other inside of me. And apparently, it was registering its disapproval as to how I was managing things. You know, it's the folks in the basement were not happy with the executive decisions made by the people on the top floor. And there was an intrapsychic revolt. And that's not the way I understood it at the time. And I came over time to appreciate a very basic element of our lives, namely that there's something in us that knows us better than we know ourselves, number one. And in the case of a depression, I had to learn to ask the question, why has my psyche autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the outer decisions I'm making with my life, all of which seem to be productive and useful, socially useful, and so forth. And it was the beginning of a different kind of exploration into what was going on inside. Now, of course, the problem with the unconscious is it's unconscious, so we can't talk about it per se. But we then have to start then paying attention to the clues that we have. And the clues show up in the feeling function. They show up in our energy systems. They show up in our dreams. They show up in what's meaningful and what's not meaningful. They show up in our psychopathology, where you have to pay attention to the fact that, as I said, your psyche is not cooperating with you. So that invites one to a dialogue. And one of the things I learned out of that process, which I keep relearning, and I believe is fundamentally at the heart of all human relationships, and that is we cannot have a relationship with another any better or more evolved than we have a relationship to our own inner life. This is not about narcissism. This is not about self absorption. This is not withdrawal from the world. Quite the contrary. It's working on ourselves in a way that we bring to our relationships as a partner, as a parent, as an employee, whatever form, a more evolved person, a more self-determining person, a person who's operating more out of a psychological and spiritual integrity, rather than one who is on automatic pilot most of the time.
But it's really hard for people to focus on the goals or doing things they really enjoy, because we're pretty much programmed in a way to be on autopilot, go to work, wake up, do our chores and everything else, and we feel
Mhm.
fearful if we pursue, let's say you have a family, you have kids, that we neglect them if we want to pursue our goals, even though if our goal is to make the life better for the whole family, we sort of fearful of what should we do, how to balance it, how to weigh it out, and we neglecting the family, are we pursuing the goal? And it's really hard these days, not everyone can do that.
It's hard all the time. It always was hard. It will always be hard. And yet, I would come back to the basic premise. If you neglect your own well being, and I don't mean that again in a narcissistic way, if you neglect what's going on inside of you, because I often ask clients, at 86, I'm still practicing psychoanalysis. I'm still privileged to share people's lives and carry with them the struggles of their journey. But I'm still impressed with the fact that there is something inside of each of us, as I said, that has a certain autonomy and knows what's right for us. And it's constantly trying to speak to us. So if I neglect that, then I'm predominantly responding to the promptings of my environment only. So this is not about choosing oneself over, say, one's family or one's children. Quite the contrary. It's saying I have to also find time to work on this particular person because that's the person I'm sharing with them. You know, Jung said once the greatest burden a child must make is, or must carry, is the unlived life of the parent. And I think wherever the parent's stuck, the child will either be stuck through imitating that or be spending a lot of energy trying to overcome that. So again, it's a burden that is passed on unintentionally quite often, but nonetheless part of a person's equipment for life and instructions for life. So I had a colleague, now deceased, Marion Woodman from Toronto, who said to the people who were starting to work with her psychoanalytically, she said, I want you to find an hour each day when you spend time addressing yourself. It could be working on last night's dream, because you do dream every night, whether you pay attention or not, to work on what's touching you, what's affecting you, what patterns are counterproductive, where they might be coming from inside of you, et cetera, et cetera. And she said almost universally people say, well, I can't devote an hour. I don't have time for that. And she said, then you're not really serious about this work, are you? Because this is, there are 100 and what, 68 hours a week. And you'd think that we could find 1 hour a day to address what's going on inside. Because again, what we don't look at inside continues to spill into the world. There was a comment by Carl Jung that haunts me on a daily basis in a constructive way. He said, what we desire, what we ignore inwardly, he said, will tend to come to us in the outer world, though we may ascribe to it the works of fate. But in some way, we've colluded through our choices or failure to make choices. We've colluded in producing these consequences that sooner or later wash up on our shores.
But how do we reset that cycle? I mean, it's easier, it's probably easier to say like, okay, let's put 1 hour aside, at the end of the day or maybe the beginning of the day, to think about the things we could utilize to do or improve our life. And what if your schedule is so tight that maybe you can only allocate 1 hour in a particular timetable schedule in between, and you still get disrupted because there are responsibilities, there are people who are pushing and needing your attention and your time, and it's very hard for you to balance it. So let's say, for example, like me recording the podcast here right now, I don't have a set schedule where I'm going to interview every guest every time, every week at the same time, because everyone has a different schedule. That means I have to reshuffle my entire schedule. And at any given moment, for example, I won't be able to record it, for example, even though my calendar is available. You book an appointment with me at 7 p.m., but something happens and I have to cancel. I might lose that person because that person is very busy, very desired, for example, in a podcast and won't have time to do it. And I have to balance out, I have to prioritize. And a lot of people facing those challenges because they might have to prioritize. They will go like, okay, I either do the podcast and or ignore the people that need me, or I'm gonna put the time towards the people I love or are important to me, but I'm not gonna do the podcast. I'm gonna lose out. And then we come to the end where, okay, I'm gonna push my desires to my kids, for example, down the line and say, okay, because I wasn't able to push it and do what I wanted to do when I was growing up, when I was an adult, or or I was a child, why don't you become a podcast host and launch a podcast? Because I couldn't do it, and I think you should do it because it's going to be not only good for you, but you're going to be successful and can, reach the stars, whatever, etc. So we're sort of in the loop where it never ends. So how can we break the cycle, and how can we find the time to do these
Well,
things?
Matt, you seem to be telling me that life is complicated and it's difficult. And let me tell you, it has always been complicated. It has always been difficult. And our lives are actually more comfortable and more privileged, by and large, for most people, at least in the Western world, than our ancestors by far. We have so many labor saving devices. But on the other hand, thanks to the internet and other such forces, we're also bombarded by stimuli continuously coming in from outside. And so one has to be flexible with this. The time I set aside usually for meditation and for working on my dreams and exploring the things that have come up for me, it's usually 6 to 7 in the morning because I value it. Other times when I can't do that for other schedule reasons, I'll find time somewhere else during the day. I don't mean to be rigid about this. One has to be flexible. But what we're saying here is in childhood, we learn, surrounded by giants, so to speak, we're tiny, vulnerable, dependent, and utterly at the mercy of what happens in our environment. We count on our environment to take care of us because we don't have the powers and the autonomy to take care of ourselves then. But that message overlearned means one's always reporting to the environmental demand of the moment. And there will always be something there, always. And what one manages to do is to neglect this conversation with oneself. And that's what furthers self estrangement, self alienation. I didn't know, that's why I was saying I had a successful life by all outer standards, but my own psyche revolted. Our conversation began with you trying to pin me down to one event in my life or one moment in my life where things were life altering, and that was certainly one. There would be others, certainly. But that was one that caused me to recognize the degree to which I was in service to a lot of internal drivers that had, quote, made me successful by external standards. But as I mentioned, the people in the basement who are really putting coal in the furnace here were not thrilled with everything. And so they revolted. And so, you know, we are rewarded by our society for sacrificing that kind of conversation with ourselves, which is one reason why the world's such a mess. I mean, stop and look and say, is there anybody here that you really could feel that you could trust in the long run, and that they've somehow have a sort of live in the house of self-collection, as an ancient Chinese text puts it, where they've in a sense been able to integrate these things for themselves. And you'll have to work hard to find such a person. Why is that the case? Because we all get unraveled. Every day we get unraveled. 100% of my books, for example, have been written at night. By that I mean from 8 p.m. to usually 10 p.m. at night. They don't happen because they just roll out. Somebody has to sit there and keystroke every single letter in every book. And guess who that is? And that's, I'm impressed with a sentence from the painter Chuck Close, who said, Amateurs wait for inspiration. He said, the rest of us just show up at the studio early and get to work. In other words, I work at it. And that's a form of conversation with myself, ironically, because yes, I can be addressing a certain kind of subject, but I don't know really what I think until I activate something inside. And that's when I begin to clarify. Is that what you really think? Why? What's that about? Can you illustrate that? Can you share that with someone else in a way that makes sense? Now that's an internal process that ultimately is a discipline and a focus and a sustaining presence over many, many weeks. And out of that comes an enlarged sense of one's own psychological reality. The ignorance of which means, again, we're mostly on automatic pilot, responding, stimulus response to what's happening in our environment. I am not suggesting in any way whatsoever neglecting one's children or one's partner or one's work assignment. I'm saying all of that's important, and so is what is driving your life. That's important. And by the way, I often ask people about a certain decision or pattern in their life. Now, what is that in service to inside of you, really? And I have to add really because you can't trust the first response. Well, that's true because of this, this, and that. We always have ready answers, which is usually the justification or the rationalization to defend the status quo, which is another way of defending our complexes. The word complex is not a negative word. It just means we have clusters of history in us, energy centers that, when activated, we respond. Some of them are positive. You stop and you look both ways before you cross the street. That's saving your life. The baby cries at 3 in the morning. You get up and change the diaper, feed the baby. Those are all positive complexes. But there are those programmed engines, if you will, that have a life of their own. We have them because we have a history, which is what I mean by saying so much of our life is on automatic pilot. We don't realize we're just responding reflexively to things. So I often say, let's try to track where that particular issue or that behavior came from inside of you. Now, I'll give you one quick example. Just recently, I was talking with a therapist who has a very deep, deep investment in her home. Nothing wrong with that. However, she was seeing very critically one of her patients, and she was doing case supervision with me, who was wanting to move, is making some big mistakes, move geographically to another part of the country and start a whole new project. And she was looking at that pretty judgmentally. And I said, now where's this really coming from inside? Because it was challenging her own need for stability and security, which are human after all. But at least know those are the voters that are making the decision intrapsychically. And it was quite a revelation to her, the degree. In other words, we were ostensibly talking about a third party, but we wound up necessarily talking about what was this activating within her own psychological issues. And we all have them because we're human beings. And so it was very revelatory that rather than see by the end of our conversation this other person making a big mistake in life, to recognize what she was doing was, heroically trying to make a significant change in her life, move in a new direction. The poet W.B. Yeats responded once when people were critical of him changing his style. This goes back over a century ago, of course. He said, "My friends have it I do wrong whenever I remake my song. They should know what issue's at stake. It is myself that I remake."
So the message you received growing up was to stay home, stay safe, don't go out there. What did that feel like to carry as a child? Not the theory of it, but what it actually felt like inside you. Can you share it with us?
Well, my dear parents, and I love them, and they're long deceased. And of course, like many children, I regret not having expressed sufficiently my appreciation for their work and sacrifices on my behalf. But my mother was an orphan. She lost her Swedish immigrant father in a coal mine. She grew up in poverty with her mother. Um, my father was pulled out of what we call grade school, age 13, because of the depression, sent to work before child labor laws clicked in. And he wanted to be a physician, but economics demanded, and he worked the rest of his life in that factory building tractors and road graders. And their message was one of survival, which I fully understand. I have deepest sympathy for that. It was, let's stay home, we'll take care of each other, we'll circle the wagons and form a defense unit. And yet as a child, I used to go out and climb up on the roof of the house and climb up into trees and look for airplanes. They were rarer when I was a child, and I was always going to run outside if I heard one going over. And little knowing I'd fly a couple million miles later in my adult life. But there was something inside that said, I grew up in America's heartland in Springfield, Illinois, the home of Abraham Lincoln. And, I always wanted to see the ocean. I wanted to see foreign countries. I just wanted to see what was in the world. And yet, what could a poor child do? I had no future. And I revered my school teachers because they taught me to read and write and the beginnings of critical thinking, analysis thinking. And they opened a world for me. And I'm just grateful to have been born in a time, century, and culture where a poor child could get an education. And for me, that was a ticket out that was not allowed to my parents. I was the first person to ever go away to university, and not to mention graduate school, nor to live in a foreign country. And I am deeply grateful and empathetic towards their life journey and their struggles. And at the same time, I knew that something would kill me to stay there. Something kill me psychologically speaking, spiritually speaking. And I'm sure that was partly true for them too. And yet the weight of lack of cultural opportunity, the weight of tradition, the weight of economics, all of these things were more than enough to shut down the life they wanted to live too. So that's what I grieve. I grieve that, not their passing, which happens to all of us, but I grieve the life they were not able to live. And that's another reason why I never take for granted, never, even at this late age, the privilege I have of education and travel and being able to conduct a life that makes sense to me. And if it doesn't, then to change it and to feel that permission. In fact, I would say, in the first half of life, you're really tasked with dealing with that world out there, as you were just pointing out quite appropriately. What is the world asking of me? What is relationship asking me? What is my career asking me, etc.? These are legitimate questions, and one has to mobilize enough ego strength and personal accountability and discipline to meet those demands. But in the second half of life, there's a different kind of question that begins to emerge, and that is, what is this journey really about from my own perspective? That's a different kind of question. And what often can rise out of that is a question that asks, what is worthy of my service? Rather than, because if I'm not asking that question consciously, I'm on automatic pilot again. I'm in service to the pressures of my environment, to my lack of models or permission or whatever. And the two biggest issues that one has to address in the second half of life, and I'm using that term very loosely, is one, permission to actually have your own life. Because there's something in our conditioning that says to us, your real job is to fit in, be acceptable to others. We understand that. That's important to every child. If that's governing the adult's experience, then he or she will collude in the shutting down of their own opportunities, their own vision, their own summons to a different life. The second issue is the recovery of personal authority. You have it as a child. It's called instinct, and A child knows what's right for it, but again, it's powerless to enact that in the world. And of course, we all have to be socialized to fit into, you learn to use a knife and fork, you learn to stop at the stop sign, et cetera, et cetera. Legitimate adaptations to the world around you. But as a result, one's personal authority, that is to say, honoring and living what is true for you at the deepest level, is often pushed into the underground. And what is true for you is going to change along the way because different stages of life, changes in the body, changes in your social environment. For example, why is it that there's something called the emptiness syndrome where people have a great sense of loss when their children move away or they lose a marriage or a partner dies or they have to retire and they didn't realize, and many people found this in the COVID epidemics, for example. One doesn't realize the degree to which my outer structure, my social demands, so to speak, are carrying my sense of self, that are something I report to every day. So I don't have to stop and reflect on who I am and what my decisions are really coming from. I just sort of keep reporting to my environment. But take that environment away, and often there's a tremendous loss that comes rushing back. A lot of people panicked, were depressed, started self-medicating, etc. Other people found in the COVID sequestering found some resources or interests or hobbies that really were life affirming or were wanting expression through them, but they had put it aside because of constantly reporting to their environment. So it's not a question of either or. Do I devote myself to my own personal development or to those around me? The answer is both. Both. Figure it out. Struggle, right? Make sacrifices, but figure it out. I raised my children with my partner. I supported them through college. I still have an ongoing and lovely conversation with them. You can ask them and they'll tell you. And at the same time, I realize that, in the end, I'm accountable for what enters the world through me. So I better figure out where it's really coming from because if I don't, I will have the voices of the past making those decisions for me.
Okay, but it's pretty much saying again that we are on autopilot. So even if we devote our life to our children, for example, or like the COVID situations where people lost close people during that time and they didn't know what to do because it has been taken away from them and they're lost basically because they've been on autopilot. They've been dependent on, raising children. They grow up, they go to university, they leave home, and now there's an empty space at home. They have no one to deal on a daily basis, or if someone passes the same situations, they would have been filling the autopilot gap. So,
Mhm.
and they haven't
Yeah.
basically thought of anything else to fill that gap. So they didn't have a hobby, they didn't develop a passion because they've been on autopilot. So it's very hard for people to do that because
Hmm.
we are expected to do a lot in life unintentionally
That's right.
even, but this is basically how we are being programmed from the very young age that we have to go to school, we have to be there at 8, we leave at 3 or 5 p.m. and
Mhm.
it's basically
Yeah.
like a computer program. We are being programmed to basically dedicate our time to other things
Mhm.
rather than think of ourselves, and the only ones that change the world, break the world, and do something incredible is the ones that are tough enough, strong enough to break that cycle and decide, okay, I'm going to sacrifice things for the better good. And, I might neglect my family, or I might not have a family, or I might not have these things immediately available to me, like fancy things, materialistic things. But down the line, I might change the world, I might cure a disease, or, other things. So it's
Mhm.
very hard. It's very, very hard for majority, I would say probably 90% of the human population to break that cycle because we are being programmed to do these things.
No, I fully agree. Life is difficult, and all I'm arguing for here today is a greater mindfulness around where inside of each of us our decisions are coming from. But we still have to tend to our outer environment. I have to repeat, I'm not talking about neglecting the legitimate demands of relationship, but you have to have a relationship to yourself as well, because that compromises those other relationships. About a month ago, I saw a recent survey that was a little surprising. It was pointing to the increased number of what they call gray divorces, that is to say, older people who decide to divorce after many years of ostensibly, productive marriage. And the number one factor, and there are many factors, of course, but the number one factor, and this was the surprise part to me, was the departure of their children. Then they suddenly realized that what was keeping us together was both serving, in perhaps a very legitimate way, our parenting project. Now that's done, we have no idea who each other is at this point, you see. Well, I think that's a good example of why that neglect along the way. Attend to those projects, but if you don't attend to the relationship again to yourself and your partner, then it's not going to work so well in the long run. At some level, and I'm saying this very metaphorically, first half of life is a big, gigantic, and unavoidable mistake. You know, you just have to go out there and do your best, and then after a while, stop and scratch your head and try to pull back a little bit and say, no, what's all that about? And what made me do that? How did I make that decision over some other decision? For example, it's perfectly understandable for people who've left their parents to start looking to partner up with someone else. And who makes babies? Young people, by and large. And they're struggling themselves to step into their journey, and not having a clue as to who they are or what those demands are really about. Will pass on all of these dilemmas, and it's only later years that you'll be able to stop and say there are patterns, and you don't have a pattern until you've done it a few times. And I've said to many people, if you want to start this process, look at the patterns in your life. You don't rise in the morning while you're brushing your teeth and you look in the mirror and you say, today you're going to do the same stupid things you've done for some time now, but chances are you will. And so you have to say, start with the patterns, particularly those that you find counterproductive to you. Where are they coming from in you? What is that in service to, really? And again, I have to always add really, because our first response is going to be the nervous ego defending its turf. You have to go deeper than that and say, but where is that really coming from inside of me? And when you begin to explore that, you'd be surprised what begins to rise to the surface. And you say, well, is this self indulgence? No, no. If you don't have that kind of conversation, then, some part of you is operating blindly. And you wonder why consequences pile up and why outcomes are so repeatedly negative. There's an old saying that's in many of the 12 step groups, insanity is doing the same thing but expecting a different outcome. If you want to change something, you're going to have to be addressing why you were in that position in the first place. What led to that? What are those factors? 'Cause they tend not to go away. It's very easy to say, well, I can blame somebody. People think you lie on a couch and complain about mom and dad. That's not the case. We're not dwelling in the past. It's just that, as a character in a novel by Faulkner said once, past isn't dead. It's not even past. It's making decisions for you today. And if you don't know that, then you're living unconsciously. Has nothing to do with your intelligence, has nothing to do with your outer accomplishments. There's something inside of you that's operating autonomously, and will continue to do so until you make it conscious. And that's what I had to face at age 35. I had a tenured position in academia, presumably knew what I was doing. But Psyche had another opinion, and it made itself pretty clear after a while.
Okay, but Younger generations are rushing towards a successful life, aiming. There's nothing wrong to aim for the stars and have a very comfortable life, but the internet is poisoning us in a way where we have to be successful overnight, accumulate materialistic things, and everyone is trying to do this overnight. So no one has the patience anymore and the time because we're rushing towards things and we think we can achieve them very quickly.
Hmm.
What's your perception on this? And do you think AI is going to, for example, be so autonomous in the future that it's going to enable us to have that time for ourselves where we can devote ourselves towards our passions and things that maybe we can have more time available to pursue?
Well, yes and no. First of all, again, you use the phrase "allow time." If we're allowed, you have to fight for it. Because that's why I gave you examples. If you don't set aside something because you too need the full treatment of care and concern, it will show up in all the other relationships. Now, to make an obvious point, I don't want to sound preachy here. Does all of that material affluence gives people a sense of abiding satisfaction with their life? The answer is obviously no. Obviously. And we are more and more dependent on these material objects, the latest shiny thing, the latest fad and fashion, because the disconnect from tribal mythology that once linked people to nature, to the gods, to tribal identity, and so forth. Those are the things that have eroded through the years, throwing people back upon themselves in a very sort of dramatic and traumatic way. And therefore, the world of self medication and distractions are treatment plans for a sense of absence in one's life, or a sense of an aching yearning for something and not really knowing what that's about. You used an interesting word there, passion. Passion comes from Latin passio, that means to suffer. And, you know, you don't hear me using the word happiness very often. I actually have a chapter in a book stolen from a line by the poet Charles Bukowski, who said, "Find what you love and let it kill you." Now, that's an interesting paradox. Find what you love and let it kill you. In other words, find what your passion is, and it will be something you feel so deeply that it virtually hurts, and you feel the richness of that experience. For example, I would never have imagined as a child or as a young person, certainly not as a young academic either, that I would spend hour after hour in my later years listening to people's stories of suffering or conflict in their lives. And yet I can't imagine a greater privilege than to share the journey of people who are, otherwise functional adults and haven't achieved life, and yet are dealing with the problems of the spirit. And that's a privilege to have that opportunity. That's a vocation. There's a big job between vocation and economic employment. Vocatus, what are you called to do or be as a human being? And I don't mean by that serving economics. Find a way to pay your bills. Yeah, that's important. I never didn't pay my bills. But I don't think I was ever motivated predominantly by economics by any means. It was all about, is what I'm doing making sense to me? Is what I'm doing value of value as I experience it? And if it's not, don't do it. I mean, I had, like any young person, tons of jobs to pay bills to get through college and that sort of thing. But I also knew that wasn't my calling. That was a different calling. And I didn't know even in my 30s what my calling was. And, I thought it was academia. It was ultimately teaching, which is why you and I are talking today. I never have left teaching. It's just teaching in a different way, you see. No, that was always my vocation. As I said a moment ago, I valued my teachers who were opening worlds to me, and I still treasure. And I can name all my grade school teachers, after 70 years or so. Ladies long dead, mostly ladies. And, I'm grateful and I'm happy to play that role for others. But you see, that's not a job that makes me happy, but I'm happy to have a job that is meaningful to me. You see the difference there? That's the payoff. It's not about pursuing happiness because that's a will of the wisp. It's like if I could have that new smartphone or if I could have that house on the hill, that would make me happy. Well, go ahead and try that. Plenty of people before you have those things, but what is happiness? It's a transitory experience of the moment that doesn't last, even with the best of circumstances. So don't be deluded about that. There are people who are unhappy because they're not happy. Well, I'd rather say, is what you're doing meaningful to you? And if it is, recognize from time to time you'll be flooded with happiness if it's meaningful to you. And it doesn't mean that it's free of stress. It doesn't mean that it's free of conflict. It doesn't mean that you don't have to pay your dues to do it. But the payoff is something inside of you responds in an affirmative way. And that's not something you can call up. That's what we think we're doing when we buy the new shiny object. But again, I don't want to sound preachy, but in the end, does it work? This is pragmatism. Does it work? And the answer is we know it doesn't. How dreadful it would be to be a royal, for example, right? How dreadful. And to be the object of people's projections, their animosity, their adoration. Is like, is there a real person there? Of course, there's a real human being there, and have the decency to respect that. But what a horrible role to have to play.
That's a powerful message. You said once that a colleague in semi-retirement told you he now had time to work on all the gobblings of the past he left behind. At this
Mhm.
stage of your life, what are yours?
I would say, and this is something I would say to a child. I'll give you an example. I was being interviewed also by someone in England about 3, 4 years ago who said, I always end my interviews by asking the person, what person in history would you want to talk to if you could? And my first reflex was, as a child, I grew up in the shadow of Abraham Lincoln, who was my childhood hero, and that was the first thing that came to mind. But then I thought about it, and I thought, I'd like to talk to myself as a 10-year-old if I could, and to say that 10-year-old because I think if you really get in touch with the 10-year-old that you were, you realize how fearful you were, how uncertain you were, how desperate you were to look for clues. What does it mean to be a big person? How am I supposed to cope with that out there? How am I supposed to deal with that? And I remember as a 10-year-old thinking, well, and I didn't know about puberty, but I recognized that the children who were in the secondary schools were more on the adult side of some kind of abyss there. And so I thought, well, maybe when you go off into the secondary school, they'll take you aside and explain to you what's going on, what life's about, who you are, what you're supposed to do. And unwittingly, I was tapping into the rites of passage that were present in ancient cultures and traditional cultures and indigenous cultures still to this day, where one is in some way taught by the elders. These are our gods. This is the nature of the universe. This is what happens when you die. This is how to be in our culture, etc. And we desperately need that. What do we do to young people? We say, well, just go out and get some computer skills and make money and good luck. And there's very little grounding anything that really affirms an inner sense of identity and purpose or even a sense of belonging. So I think I would talk to that child and say, it's going to be all right. you know Don't be afraid of being afraid. That's normal and natural. Try to start recognizing how many of your choices of complicity or avoidance might be generated by your fears. That's understandable. We're not here to judge that. You're a child, right? But just start paying attention to that and realize every time you do that, something is not coming from a good place inside of you. It's reactive, essentially. And I think I would have been reassuring to that child. Yeah, there will be bumps and bruises out there, but you'll find your way, and you'll find a life, and you'll find relationships with others that are truly worth the struggle. You'll find some good people and some not so good people in your journey, but in time you'll be able to tell the difference, and you won't be dependent on them. You will be able to navigate your own course. There's a line from American poet Emily Dickinson in 1863 who said, "The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can." And I think it was her recognition of, one, the declining of the institutional powers of authority in the past and the loss of tribal and village mythology, and the need for people to have a compass. And if you have a compass, you can find your directions. You can find what's true north for you. If you don't have a compass, you're going to be at the mercy of whatever is the loudest voice in your environment, whether external environment or internal environment, and then you're adrift. So you better know that you have a compass and that you, from time to time, consult it. And this is why with so many clients, I've said when they face a large decision in their life or juncture, you know, which path here enlarges you, which path diminishes you? And usually, as vague as that question might be, they usually know the answer to that automatically, just intuitively. And if they don't, you say, all right, let's stick with this for a while. And its answer, its clarity will come to them. Of that, I have no question. And we have to take the path of psychological enlargement. Where are you blocked by fear? Where are you blocked by lack of role models? Where are you forced into this channel because of your needs for adaptation, your fears of being alone or not understood by someone? We all have those things. That's human. But those are the things that are your real enemy. In one book called The Mental Passage, I said every morning, whether you're aware of it consciously or not, you better get aware of it. There are two gremlins at the foot of your bed, and they're the enemies of your life. One is called fear, and it says to you, hey, it's too much for you. Chill out, pull the blanket over your head. The other one is lethargy or indolence. Uh, have some chocolate, turn on the TV. Tomorrow's another day. And after a while, you realize those forces intimidated you and shut you down. And we carry in our psyches, carry in our heads, so to speak. They are your enemy. There's no enemy out there. It's all inside, fear and lethargy. If you can make them conscious, you see them addressing and trying to sabotage your life, then you know what your proper task is. And that's not to be defined by them. You see, that's something you have to step into. That's why if you choose the path of enlargement, you live a larger life, not necessarily in the outer world, but in terms of the sense of you're utilizing what is meant to be brought in the world through your being on this planet.
And so this podcast in particular is watched mostly by young people trying to figure out how to build a meaningful life. If someone in their 20s is watching this and feels like they are already living the wrong story, the parents' story, the culture story, what is the first thing you'll want them to actually do? Not understand, but actually do.
Well, we're not looking for villains here. We're not looking for someone to blame. If this isn't your life, whose life is it? So you better face the fact that what you're going to need is courage. Courage to perhaps step out on your own, to say, and number one comes, you know, recognize what you just said. You know, I'm living a received life, a received set of instructions, maybe with the best of intentions. My parents were trying to be protective to me. I appreciate that. That's the world they knew, and I also knew their protections were constrictive. Ultimately, no judgment against them, but accountability on my own. But first, recognize how often we are either serving those messages or trying to get away from them. But they're not present. They're always present, right? Even in later years. Secondly, realize it's going to take courage to address my life and be accountable. And that's what it really means to be an adult. Frankly, there are a lot of people in big bodies and big roles in life who are psychologically still adolescent. And an adult is a person who is recognizing, no matter what the outer influences may be, no matter what the historic influences may be, I am still accountable for the decisions I make and the consequences that spill into the world through me. I am accountable for that. And that's the next step. And then the courage comes in saying, and what inside of me calls me in a different direction. And frankly, those questions can feel so large, so intimidating. We drift into a world of distraction, which is what our popular culture is designed to treat. Is, oh, you don't have to worry about this. Just turn on the telly and or the internet and do this or that, or materialism. Say, oh well, just make money and it'll take care of itself. Well, do you really think so? And recognize that this is a long journey. Unless fate intervenes and cuts that journey short, which we never know about. It's a long journey, and you're going to fall on your face. You're going to make mistakes. That's okay. It's what you do then that matters. You pick yourself up and you deal with the world. I have a de facto motto that actually I mentioned in one book that some people have put on their refrigerator or their bathroom window as a reminder every day. And this is my advice to me: shut up, suit up, show up. Shut up says to me, oh, so you hurt today. Your body hurts. That's what happens. Shut up. There are people out there with real suffering. They don't have a roof over their head. Their children are dying. They don't have food. What do you have to complain about? Shut up. I don't want to hear that. I'm speaking to myself, mind you. Secondly, suit up, prepare, work hard. Don't expect somebody to give it to you. Do your homework. Do your proper diligence. Thirdly, just do the best you can. Not show off, show up. Just do the best you can. We all fumble important things in life. We all make mistakes. The capacity to forgive oneself and be accountable is a difficult paradox. But the more conscious you are, the more for which we're accountable. But, it's why a character in Dostoevsky in Notes from Underground said, how can anybody with any sense of clarity have any self-respect? Well, that's true, and we also have to respect ourselves. So that's why it's a paradox. Paul Tillich's definition of grace was accept the fact that you're accepted despite the fact that you're unacceptable, right? So there's the paradox: is we all screw up, we all make mistakes, but keep at it and say, where did that come from in me? What is seeking its expression through me? How much of my life is being responsive to the drivers from inside that have arrived from my family and my culture and so forth? And long-term question is, what wants to live in the world through me? And it can be various things, your work life, your relational life, your children, whatever. But in the long run, it's a service to the mystery. Jung said once, life is a short pause between two great mysteries. which is a pretty good definition. We don't know from whence we've come or whither we go, but this is what we have. And the question is, what are you going to do with that? What is this short pause about? And with all due respect, you don't let someone else tell you what to do. You have to find what your particular inner voice is wishing from you and pay attention to that. And then somehow you'll find, in the face of external obstacles of all kinds and difficulties in life, including the schedule you were referencing, you'll find a way. And hopefully it'll be your way and not someone else's.
Wow, that's very powerful. That's very powerful to listen to and digest. But you've spent your career helping people identifying their shadows. What is you, and is it something you've tamed or something you're still in relationship with? Is there something? Have you got any shadows that you're still dealing with at your stage, at your age in life?
Yeah, the shadow was Jung's term for all of the elements in our personalities or our outer affiliations, like religious or political bodies or whatever. That when we make them conscious, we find them contrary to our intentions, perhaps. And we all get in our ways. We still make fear-based decisions at times. We still do things reflexively. Um, you know, no one achieves complete individuation, which was Jung's term for this process of, becoming oneself in the world. And again, that's in service to the life force, not to one's ego comforts. Because many of the people that you would value in life and respect historically had very difficult lives. But what you respect of them is they found what was true for them and they lived it to the best of their ability. And that's what you value from them. So, yes, one always has a shadow. And, if you really pay attention, there's always some tendency for self inflation, for thinking one's fully conscious. And yet, on a daily basis, we're called to action. One of the best definitions of a complex was our old brother Hamlet. For what 1604, who said, "Resolution, that is my intentionality, is sicklied over with the pale cast of thought, and lose the name of action." That pale cast of thought is Shakespeare's intuition of the unconscious rising as a complex and shutting the person down or directing them in a pathway that is not the right place for them, you see. So, Shakespeare's longest play was about a person who knew perfectly well what he wanted to do, what he needed to do, and what was approved of by his milieu at the time. And for reasons he couldn't explain for a very long time, he couldn't do it. So, that's why I call him our brother Hamlet, because his inner conflict, his inner apprehensions around that were, the source of his shadow and his reluctance to step into, you know, the proper demands that life was making of him.
If your life had a message so far, what would it be? You've shared a lot of wonderful stories and wisdom and advices that literally will be very valuable for the listeners of this particular episode. Is there one you can share at the end of this interview?
Yes, yes. Well, I think I've been acknowledging that along the way, is that I had to move just from the life of the mind, which was rich and valuable, of course, to realizing that there is a claim of the heart for us and there's a claim of the soul. The word psyche is the Greek word for soul. That is that most deeply personal part of you that is your living reality. Everything comes out of the soul, so to speak. The word psychotherapy means, from the Greek, to listen or attend to the soul. So there's, again, something inside that knows you better than you know yourself, because we have all these flying ideas about adaptation, success, fitting in, doing the right thing, whatever. And it's a humbling thing. It doesn't make you feel aggrandized. It's often a summons that you have to address, but it's purposeful, it's meaningful. And if you live what is meaningful, that will serve you better than any other single value, which is why relationships are so important. They are meaningful. But so, is the work of your hands, the work of your mind, the work of your heart. All those things are meaningful. So, as a card carrying introvert, when I woke this morning, I felt a little ripple of existential angst because it's an unnatural act for me to talk, in public, though I've been doing it for decades. But that's my calling. So, shut up, suit up, show up, and here we are. And that's what life asks of you. Not show off, but show up as who you are. Risk being that person. Not everybody's going to stand and applaud. My parents, I think, were appalled at times of my departures and risks I took in life. And even though I knew that I traveled with their love, and that was wonderful. At the same time, I was here to live my journey, and I have the deepest of love and respect for them and theirs. And so, you know, life is very simple and very difficult. The simple thing is something inside of you knows what's right for you. The difficult part is now you have to live it. And um, that's going to take courage and endurance. And over time, that makes a difference and is the best gift, ironically, you can share with others, especially your partner and your children.
Wow, very powerful. James, thank you very much for this inspirational conversation. I think there are some really wonderful stories and lessons to learn from. And I'm very grateful. I think time is the most valuable commodity that anyone can give to someone because you're never going to get it back.
That's
And
right.
I'm very, very grateful for you being here today with me and sharing all these stories and yeah, making the time and the effort to, yeah, to do something greater. And I hope I will be able to, yeah, change people's lives, even a handful of that will make a difference and it will mean the world to me. So thank you very much. I truly appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, Matt, and thank you for the invitation. And this is apparently what I'm supposed to do with myself. If that changes, I'll let you know. Right?